From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power alongside Joe Matthew. I'm Anne-Marie Horner.
This hour, the fate of Speaker McCarthy's debt ceiling bill is in the balance, with the House debating his proposal. Still unclear if he has the votes.
This is a political game. It's not a solution. It's a finger-pointing exercise.
And President Biden meets with South Korea's President Yoon with a message of unity against a nuclear North Korea.
Attack by North Korea against the United States or its allies or partisans or partners is unacceptable and will result in the end of whatever regime were to take such an action.
We'll discuss that and more with Richard Haass, president of the Council on Foreign Relations.
And Walt Disney Company takes it to court. The House of Mouse filing suit against Florida Governor Ron DeSantis over what it calls the governor's relentless campaign to weaponize government power. As the House prepares to vote on Kevin McCarthy's debt limit bill here, we've got breaking news from all quarters. A state visit underway at the White House on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. And this bombshell from Florida. And Marie, looks like Ron DeSantis is going to court.
Absolutely. And it does feel like in that story, which we're going to get to much later in the program, is this idea of going after woke companies, because this is how you play to your base. Has that gone too far? Because some people are saying, actually, this is against conservative policies.
Well, that's right. It really could end up being a story of overplaying your hand, particularly as Donald Trump calls him out for this action. And it could be an unprecedented case, maybe I should say precedent setting for this argument going forward in the campaign.
Certainly. And also happening right now, though, most pressing matter. McCarthy may be on the verge of actually getting this passed through the floor after 15 rounds of a speaker vote, potentially in one vote. He's going to be able to, again, this is a means to an end. This is a way that he could orchestrate that he has his conference behind him so he can go to Biden and try to strike a deal. But he's taking the floor to the vote. He likely has 218.
Yes, that's right. And it follows last-minute changes. The Rules Committee went till 2 o'clock in the morning. We're glad that you joined us. You chose the right place because we will likely find out, we certainly hope so, this hour, the fate of this bill as the House prepares to vote on what is called the Limit, Save, Grow bill. And joining us from Capitol Hill with the latest on this is Bloomberg's Emily Wilkins. Emily, we'll have to start with the most basic question here. Does he have the votes?
It seems like he does. There were a number of folks last night who said that they were opposed, that they were not going to be voting for this bill. That made it look like it was in jeopardy. But McCarthy spent all day today twisting arms, getting folks on board. Certainly those handful of changes that they put into place at 2 in the morning were helpful. They addressed concerns that Iowans had about corn and biofuels. They addressed some concerns that those across the conference had on when work requirements would start. And remember, of course, no lawmakers really expect that this is going to be the final bill. This is just something that Republicans want to pass to put pressure on Biden to get him to the White House. And at this point, it does seem, based on the whip counts, based on the conversations that I and others have had with lawmakers today, that McCarthy very likely has this vote in the bag. We're expecting voting to start any minute now and for passage to come before the end of the hour.
And not just that, the speaker is also going to have a news conference. So you'd likely think if he's taking this to the floor and then he's announcing a news conference, he's probably feeling very confident going into this vote. But Emily, as you said, this is really just a leveraging tool for the speaker. So why wouldn't Republicans vote for it right now?
For a lot of Republicans, they want to make sure they're showing unity, but even more important, they want to make sure that they're showing the folks at home that they're representing them. And look, Anne-Marie, you know this as well as I do. The margins up here are very, very narrow. And what that means is that any group of lawmakers has a lot of power in pushing for what they want. So take Nancy Mace. She was one of the holdouts, a Republican from South Carolina. She went to McCarthy and said, hey, I want legislation to balance the budget. She got that promise. If you're one of the 4 Republicans from Iowa, you wanted some things on biofuels. They were able to get a few changes there. They know that this is overall a negotiation, and they know that whatever they pass will be used as a negotiating tool. So it does mean something to members whether or not they're able to secure wins. And since the threshold is so low, it makes it very, very easy for them. If you and 3 friends agree on something, you can put pressure on Speaker Kevin McCarthy to give it to you.
Oh, yes, such slim margins. Our thanks to Bloomberg's Emily Wilkins, who'll be up on the Hill covering this vote. Joining us around the table here are Bloomberg's Kate Davidson and Sam Kim. Kate, let's start with you. So it looks like he's on the verge. It's going to be a huge win for him. What happens next?
So this is really just a starting point, as you said. It's giving him leverage. It's allowing him to, go to the White House and say, look, here is where we stand. Let's start these conversations. And the White House has been clear for some time that they're not interested in sitting down and talking until Republicans come to them with something on paper that they are all willing to get behind. And this is really an important starting point for that next phase of some kind of agreement eventually on how to resolve this issue with the debt ceiling.
So we'll look back at the 26th of April as an important stop on the road, maybe the beginning of a conversation that matters, to your point. The next big stop is going to be the X date, and that could come at any minute here, right?
Well, so the X date is a little while away, but what is coming any minute is an estimate. Exactly.
We need a number here. We need a date.
For sure, right. And so this is obviously very important because Congress, as we know by now, they don't do anything unless they're told, here is the drop-dead deadline.
And even then,
they're probably going to go right up to the date if history repeats itself, which it probably will. So, yes, any day now we'll find out from the Treasury Department what their estimate is of a date. I think it's important to note when we talk about X date, what we're going to get from Treasury, it's not going to be the date that they expect the U.S. could default. What the letter, because it will come in the form of a letter to Congress, will likely say is we have confidence that we can pay the bills through this date. It's probably going to be a date maybe sometime in June. It really depends on how corporate tax receipts have come in. That's what Treasury is looking at. But, in reality, there's probably a little bit of a buffer after that date for Congress to act.
And many were expecting, though, later in the summer, early fall. So June also makes it a lot of pressure on these politicians to get something done. I just want to ask you about what Biden, how the White House is now playing this, because he kind of changed the tune. If you look at the nuances, it used to be show me a budget and then we can sit down and talk. Now he's saying, I'm happy to meet with McCarthy, but not on whether or not the debt limit gets extended. That's not negotiable. So basically now he's saying, take default off the table and we can meet. But before it was show me your budget and we can meet. Is that White House potentially moving in a little bit?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think what they really don't want to appear to be doing is negotiating over the debt ceiling, because they've said time and time again, we're not negotiating over this. It has to happen. So, okay, if you want to have a conversation about fiscal policy and government spending and where that's headed, we'll have that conversation. But, we need assurances that you're going to support a debt limit increase. So I think that, a lot remains to be seen about how those two issues are tied together and how this takes shape. But I do think that they are trying to hold on to the control here.
Mm-hmm. We talked to Senator Ted Cruz about this yesterday on Balance of Power. His take on the debt ceiling debate. Here he is.
It is critically important for leaders in the House and leaders in the Senate to force real spending reforms. Now, let me be clear. Under no circumstances should the United States default on our debt. And there's one person on planet Earth who could make that 100% certainty. That's Joe Biden.
And so we wait to hear from the White House following this vote. Senator Ed Markey, to hear from the Democratic side reacting to the showdown earlier today in a conversation with Bloomberg. Here he is.
I don't think Speaker McCarthy is acting in good faith right now. I think he's just making a proposal to appease the most radical elements of the Republican Party. I think ultimately when he gets serious, I think that the Democrats will get serious.
This is just an incredible lack of trust between the two parties and between both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue right now. So it's going to be fascinating in the next hour to see how this pans out.
Yeah, exactly. Also happening on the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue, even though the vote is very exciting, we have President Biden meeting with South Korea's President Yoon. He's here for a state visit at a very difficult time, given the fact that these leaks came out. Sam Kim, thank you for joining us and welcome to Washington. You'll be with us for a few months, but you're in Seoul normally. Give us the sense of the lead up to this visit and how potentially complicated it was due to the fact that these leaks happened.
Well, the sense I got while I was in Korea was that the presidential office of Yoon Suk-yeol wanted to kind of play this down as much as possible because these things happened right before the summit with Joe Biden, which is a very important partner for Yoon. And the local media tended to see this as something like that. You know, they want to have this played down. They want the presidential office wants to keep quiet about this issue. And I think kind of played out for them very well, given that it didn't really hurt his approval ratings before coming to Washington. So I think President Yoon basically thinks and wants to think this way. The relations that we have with the United States is much more important than any risk of damaging.
And them spying on them.
Exactly. I mean, I think there's a bit of sense also in Korea that they kind of assume that something like that might be happening. Look, there's American soldiers, about 30,000 American soldiers stationed, and some of them are stationed right at the center of the city. They still are, and there's massive intelligence operations. I'm not saying they're spying on South Korea, but they need to do that in order to, maintain the security around the peninsula. They have China, they have North Korea. So this is an important operation for South Korea, according to some of the people who are okay with the idea. And you mentioned trust, and trust is something that is really important for Korea.
Well, with regard to that, these two presidents went into overtime in the Oval Office. Their bilateral news conference began 90 minutes late with people waiting in the sun in the Rose Garden. Was it the conversation about economic tensions or national security that kept them there?
That's a good question. I mean, I wasn't inside the meeting, so I can't tell you with 100% confidence, but there's a lot more to the alliance between South Korea and the U.S. now than there used to be 10, 20 years ago. Korea is probably one of the biggest semiconductor manufacturers in the world.
Yes, right.
In terms of memory chips, they control 2/3 of the entire market. So there's a lot more that the U.S. expects from South Korea because they want to turn things around in terms of supply chains against China. They need South Korea.
Thank you, Sam, for the insights. A great conversation. Sam Kim and Bloomberg's Kate Davidson with us at the table here to get things started on a breaking news day in Washington. Coming up, President Biden hosting the South Korean president at the White House. Council on Foreign Relations President Richard Haass weighs in on that next here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
Our mutual defense treaty is ironclad, and that includes our commitment to extended deterrence, and that includes the nuclear threat and the nuclear deterrent. They're particularly important in the face of DPRK's increased threats and the blatant violation of U.S. sanctions.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Thanks for joining us. President Biden talking nuclear coordination, technology, investments, and a lot more with South Korea's President Yoon today at the White House, a state dinner to follow. And joining us to discuss all of it now is Richard Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, author of The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens. Richard, welcome back to Bloomberg. It's great to have you here. Quite a bit of talk today about security, and we can sort of unpack the economic side of this in a moment as well. But the president had tough words for North Korea, says he would end the regime if it crosses the line, deploying a nuclear-armed submarine to waters off South Korea as part of a deal so they don't pursue their own nuclear program. And so I wonder, who was the real audience today when these two presidents reached the Rose Garden? Was it Kim Jong-un or President Xi?
It's partially Kim Jong-un. Even more, it was the South Korean people. South Korea lives under the shadow now, not just of China, which is nothing new, but a fast-growing North Korean nuclear and missile arsenal. And they want some reassurance that the United States commitment is good. If you're old enough to remember, this reminds me a lot of the 50s and 60s. And when de Gaulle and others in France were saying, how can we trust you to put New York at risk in order to save Paris? Well, this is the South Korean equivalent. Are you going to be there to defend Seoul if North Korea, which increasingly has missiles that can reach the United States, potentially with nuclear weapons, can we count on you? South Korea was unnerved by President Trump when he threatened to pull all 28,000 U.S. troops out of their country. So what you saw is the president involved in strategic reassurance, basically saying, we're going to visit you with nuclear-capable systems. We're going to send some messages to the North. We're going to involve you more intimately in any nuclear decision-making. But that's what this is about.
When you have the South Korean president here, the timing, of course, at an awkward moment. Our own Sam Kim said that back home in Seoul, people are really trying to downplay this leap. At the end of the day, what this shows that the U.S. was spying on their allies. How much do you think this overshadowed the conversations that took place today?
I don't think it did. The Koreans made a strategic or political decision not to put this front and center. It was awkward. It was embarrassing, but it is. They were unhappy even before any of this over the question of access of electronic vehicles made in South Korea to the U.S. market. They thought that what we were doing was protectionist. And by the way, they may have had a pretty good point there. But we've got lots of issues. South Korea, which is one of the world's 12 largest economies, is trying to represent itself or portray itself as a large, not just regional, but global partner of the United States. So they weren't going, I think they made a clear command decision not to allow the awkwardness of the monitoring of the conversations to get in the way of the visit.
Richard, the U.S. may surpass China as a top destination for South Korean imports this year. With that in mind, is America doing enough here economically to preserve this relationship as we try to control exports to China of high-tech equipment and some other items here? Are we making up the difference for South Korea?
Well, it's difficult, but we're doing quite a lot. The free trade agreement really helps. Indeed, without that, we'd be in real trouble because, as everybody knows, the United States, I think, made the short-sighted decision not to join, not to participate in the largest regional economic grouping. But again, we've got this bilateral mechanism with South Korea. So I think that essentially is okay. What we've got to do is iron out some of the protectionist measures that have crept into this relationship.
I want to also ask you about the phone call that took place today. This was widely anticipated for months, and then it never happened. And this was with President Xi Jinping calling President Volodymyr Zelensky. What is your reaction? Does this undermine, in some senses, what the United States is trying to do? Because what China is putting forward is not really a wholehearted peace plan, given the fact that obviously it weighs heavily on Russia, and this would really mostly benefit Putin.
Look, before the war, Ukraine was a really important economic partner of China. I think China was its largest economic partner. Ukrainians are basically hoping that China will use some of its leverage with Vladimir Putin. So that was the whole reason for this delayed phone call. And the real question, and neither the Ukrainian nor Chinese readout cast a lot of light on it, Emery, well, whether the Chinese are actually prepared to lean on Putin. If they wanted to, they could. It's not just what they don't do vis-a-vis Russia, it's what pressure they could put on them. Obviously, Ukraine is hoping for it. China wants to burnish its image as a great diplomat and peacemaker. Well, here's a chance to show it. So we'll see what comes after this this phone call. And I don't resent that. I don't think the United States should resist it. If China can do good things, we ought not to be silly and say we're not going to support it just because it emanated from China. We should focus on what they do, not on where it comes from.
Yeah, and of course, they're also going to be sending a representative to Kyiv. So that was also another insight that seems very important. Richard Haass, thank you so much for joining us. President, of course, of the Council on Foreign Relations. Coming on the program, First Republic shares plunging with no rescue deal in sight. Bloomberg's Katie Lyons will be here with more on that story. That's coming up next on Balance of Power.
I'm really concerned about the fallout. In particular, I'm concerned that we're seeing a flight of capital away from community banks, away from mid-sized banks to the giant banks. If depositors say, well, I'm safe if I'm at a giant bank, but at a smaller bank I'm not, that really has a negative impact across the board.
That was Senator Ted Cruz speaking with us here on Balance of Power around this time yesterday as concerns about deposit flight further engulf First Republic Bank with its ability to survive very much in question today. Bloomberg's Katie Lyons is here with more. This has been another brutal day for First Republic.
Yeah, 2 days in a row. The stock is down 64% just in a 2-day period. This was a $121 stock at the start of this year. It closed today at less than $6 per share. This has been absolutely brutal, of course, dealing with a crisis in confidence that really wasn't made better by the fact that it reported on Monday that deposits in the first quarter fell 41%. And of the $104 billion in deposits they have left, $20 billion of those are uninsured, and $30 billion is from the infusion that larger banks gave it in order to stabilize it. But clearly, stabilization doesn't seem to have yet been achieved. This is a bank that very much needs a rescue. The question now is whether that is going to come from the private sector or if the government has to step in. We've had reporting over the last several days of the bank considering selling up to $100 billion in assets, reporting today about a share sale that would require those banks that already attempted to rescue it to buy bonds at a loss, basically. And then a great scoop from our colleague Katanga Johnson here at Bloomberg that the FDIC is looking internally at possibly lowering this bank's rating, the CAMELS rating, which is essentially just an assessment of its health, which could curb its ability to tap into Fed lending facilities, the discount window, the Bank Term Funding Program. And if it's cut off to that really makes it struggle even harder. It seems like almost like the FDIC would be looking to force banks' hand here to come and step in.
It feels like we've come a very long way from Jamie Dimon sitting down with Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. And is that what needs to happen again?
Well, it's a good question because the government clearly doesn't want to get involved and take another hit to the insurance fund, basically, because they've already taken a very large hit because of the failures of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank. So they would like a private sector solution. But the banks really do have issue with some of these assets here. Remember, First Republic, nearly half of its assets are in home loans and non-interest principal payments being paid for a decade in some cases. So the actual balance sheet is a problem for a lot of potential buyers, and a government sweetener maybe would be needed. But at this point, the government doesn't seem to think that this bank poses a systemic risk, therefore maybe doesn't want to step in.
You know, the deposits that Anne Marie mentioned that J.P. Morgan led, that was, I believe, an agreement for 120 days.
Yes.
Is there a chance that gets extended? Is there a chance they don't get their money back?
These are good questions that we're looking for answers to. But in theory, if this bank were allowed to fail and those depositors wouldn't be made whole, then these banks would be out that $30 billion. So perhaps that is an incentive for them to do a deal. But again, they still have hangups about that. We're still looking for a solution.
All right, our Bloomberg's Kay Lyons, thanks for that. Joe, what comes to mind, too, what Kayleigh was talking about, they don't want to take a hit, the government. They don't want to go out and extend to the banks again, but also they don't want to take a hit politically.
Well,
They're just going to be looking,
especially if it's not savable.
Not just financially, but politically.
Amazing
At the same time that they're trying to negotiate a debt ceiling. That's what we're going to be talking about coming up next. Dive into how the debt ceiling impacts the markets. More with Libby Cantrill, Managing Director and of Public Policy at PIMCO. This is Balance of Power.
Happy to meet with McCarthy, but not on whether or not the debt limit gets extended. That's not negotiable. I notice they quote Reagan and they quote Reagan all the time, and they quote Trump, both of which said, it says, I'm paraphrasing, it would be an absolute crime to not extend the debt limit.
There's something you don't see every day. President Biden talking about Trump and Reagan. He's addressing the debt ceiling showdown earlier, speaking from the Rose Garden on the heels of a news conference with South Korea's president. Joining us now to discuss is Libby Cantrill, Managing Director and Head of Public Policy at Pacific Investment Managing Company, PIMCO, of course. Libby, fantastic note really outlining what comes next. It does look like the speaker's going to have 218. He's bringing it to the floor. He's had a news conference after. Then what?
Yeah, and good evening. This is actually very important. Speaker McCarthy does look like he will have the votes for this sort of opening bid, this opening salvo, if you will. Of course, none of what the 218 will, or 219 or what have you, will pass, will end up getting into law. But again, it sort of kicks off these negotiations as sort of an opening bid. So what's next? Majority Leader Schumer may bring this bill up, let it fail, sort of to illustrate that there are not the votes to pass the House bill and have it signed into law by the president. Of course, Biden's already threatened that he would veto it anyway. But again, the important thing, I think, from a market's perspective is that this sort of kicks off the process and likely will put some pressure on President Biden and some of the Democrats to actually come to the negotiating table with the Republicans in both the House and the Senate to hammer out a deal.
Libby, you're writing to clients today that it will be a bumpy ride, but the destination is known. The U.S. will not default. So what form is this going to take? Will they actually agree to lift the debt ceiling through May of next year or whatever the date ends up being, or suspend it for a couple of months while they figure out the path?
Yeah, well, I think it's the sort of vast majority of folks in Washington and including President Biden to postpone or suspend or extend the debt ceiling, however you want to phrase it, past the November 2024 election. I think that will be part of the negotiation, Joe. I think folks will be pretty loath to increase it for a short term. Now, that is certainly possible. And as we've discussed, it's dependent on when the X date falls. If the X date is closer to early June, then you may actually see a higher likelihood of just a short-term deal. But I think assuming that the X date is sort of late July, August, around that congressional recess, I think they're going to try to negotiate to try to punt this beyond the November 2024 election. Again, I think that is one of the levers that folks will pull in this negotiation.
We heard from what President Biden had to say, and he said he would be happy to meet with Speaker McCarthy, but he didn't mention the budget. He just said he wants to make sure default is off the table. Is that the White House potentially opening up slightly to some sort of negotiation?
Yeah, look, I mean, the White House, like previous White Houses, have really tried to separate the debt limit from spending discussions, because as we all know, the debt limit is backward looking. It simply allows the country to issue more debt to finance spending that's already been appropriated or obligated or what have you. The budget discussion is more forward looking. So President Biden is trying to kind of strike that balance or that nuance. I'm not sure it's going to be able to hold. I do think that the White House and Democrats realize that this is just too important. The stakes are just simply too high for them to sort of insist on a clean debt ceiling increase. We will see, though. I do think there's some things, though, the Democrats can give to Republicans here that actually could benefit them politically as well. One of them is this energy permitting bill, this issue that has been live that Senator Manchin, the Democrat from West Virginia, has talked a lot about. President Biden has already indicated he would support this. So this could be sort of part of the negotiation. So again, I think kind of the bottom line for markets is we don't think there will be a default. We think it will be a bumpy ride, may not be a deal until the 11th hour, could be some volatility in the markets, but there will be a resolution some way, somehow. Again, the stakes are just too high and the political incentives are too clear to avoid default.
Libby, it was the default, not an actual, or the downgrade rather, not an actual default that hit the markets back in 2011. What's the conversation like right now at places like S&P and Fitch as they watch this unfold in Washington? How close to the X date do you think they're willing to go this time before taking action?
Yeah, I think, Joe, that's an open question. And for our clients, especially that are very sensitive to downgrades, it is going to be something that they're going to be monitoring quite quickly. Or quite closely, excuse me. I think Fitch has been the only credit rating agency who sort of indicated that if we were to default and yet bond payments were to be prioritized, that would still likely be a default. And that's important because there are some folks on the Hill who are arguing, well, as long as bond holders like PIMCOs of the world are being paid, it will not be default. Fitch is sort of indicating, no, it actually would be a technical default, and that would have a cascading impact. That's, of course, the case of default, which we don't think, again, is likely. But again, an open question as to if there is no resolution, days before the X date, will the credit rating agencies move to at least put the country on watch? And I think that's very possible.
At what point, Libby, does the market start to actually pay attention?
Yeah, I mean, we've been obviously talking a lot about this with our clients. I will say this is our number one question that we are getting from clients. The markets, as you all know, are starting to dislocate in some areas. For instance, in the Treasury bills, lots of risk aversion, trying to avoid the 3-month T-bill, kind of going into the 1-month T-bill because that doesn't necessarily fall under this X date period of time. So we're already seeing some dislocation, again, that front end of the yield curve. You're also seeing some dislocation in the CDS for U.S. sovereign debt. That is as we've talked about, a very liquid, very small market. So kind of take it for what it is. But when does it sort of start impacting the broader market? Usually the equity market is a laggard. It doesn't necessarily react until kind of the weeks, if not days, before the X date. So I think there's going to be a lot of kind of sanguineness until then, until folks get some more clarity around the X date. And if there is no resolution, again, it's kind of weeks, days beforehand, then that's when you start seeing a volatility. But Anne-Marie, just really an important point, though. All of that that downturn in the market before the X date and previous debt ceiling standoffs have retraced, except for in 2011 when the market sold off for other reasons. The European debt crisis was front and center during that period of time, of course.
Something we're hoping to not relive. PIMCO's Libby Cantrill. Libby, you've been great with your insights today. Thanks so much for joining us. Just to update where we are here, a motion to recommit appears to be about to fail, Anne-Marie. Then we're on to an actual vote. Kevin McCarthy did schedule a news conference for this hour. We'll see if we get that far.
Yeah, certainly. Does he have the 218? I think he
says yes.
He feels pretty confident. It's also happening, but on the Senate side, Elon Musk returned to the Capitol Hill, and he met with Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. He's also in town meeting with South Korea's leader, who brought 120 executives with him. But lots
he was there just about a month ago to say happy birthday to Kevin McCarthy, so I guess he's a regular here. Coming up, we're joined by our political panel to break all of this down, beginning with the debt ceiling, GOP donors, and we'll get to the race to 2024. Stay with us on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.
Now, keeping you up to date with news from around the world, here's the first word. I'm John Hyland. Norfolk Southern's profit took a hit in the first quarter on a charge related to the train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio in February. The accident dumped chemicals on the small town and led to congressional hearings. It cost the railroad $387 million in profits. And that shaved off $1.28 off its earnings per share, which fell by 89 cents compared to a year ago. An independent team of aviation safety experts will review recent near collisions at U.S. airports. The 6 people on the panel will advise the FAA on how to improve the air traffic safety system. In January and February, there were 8 incidents involving airliners that were rated as severe by the FAA or resulted in investigations. And a mega deal is under fire. The UK's antitrust watchdog vetoed Microsoft's proposed $69 billion takeover of game maker Activision Blizzard. It said the merger would allow the tech giant to, quote, undermine new and innovative competitors. Microsoft's pledging to appeal that decision, even as it awaits rulings from regulators in the U.S. and the EU. And there's a sign that Netflix's crackdown on password sharing could backfire. The streaming giant lost 1 million users in Spain in the first 3 months of the year. That's according to market research group Kantar. In February, Spain became one of Netflix's first markets to introduce a fee for users who shared their login details with another household. Global news powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm John Hyland, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. I'm Joe Matthew, along with Anne-Marie Hordern in Washington, with a view of the House floor now and a vote that's taking place as we speak on Speaker Kevin McCarthy's debt limit proposal. The math is tough here for the Speaker, as we've described, and we've already got a few nays, 4 on the Republican side right now, which is, depending on the attendance, just about all that he'll be able to withstand. But Anne-Marie, Speaker McCarthy has been speaking confidently. He scheduled a news conference at the conclusion of this vote. We might, in fact, hear from him this hour because he thinks he's got to win. Yeah,
he took it to the floor. He's scheduling to talk to the press. He's been very confident. And also, behind the scenes, of course, last night, while we were all sleeping, this meeting went until about 2 a.m. They actually changed the bill.
They sure did.
So he really caved into some members of his caucus, whether it's the Westerners who needed biofuel taxes back in there, or some of the hard right that wanted to accelerate some work requirements for Medicaid. He's given in to their demands. And again, this is literally a measure to try to get Biden in a room. He needs to just show he has some backing. And I think he's been trying to really urge his members to remember that.
It's interesting. We're not voting on the forever home here. This is kind of just the next stop in the road, right? And joining us to discuss our political panel, let's get into it with Lisa Camusa Miller, Reset Public Affairs partner and former Republican National Committee Communications Director. Join at the table as well with Roger Fisk, former aide to President Obama, founder of New Day Strategy. It's great to see you both here. Lisa, what are you hearing from Republican circles? This is a done deal?
Well, I know it's hard to see the math that's going to work out, right? So I think we're going to have to see what happens. There'll be some negotiations on the floor. The other thing I think that's interesting is that we're starting to hear now that potentially the White House is going to, regardless of how this comes down, the White House is going to open up the idea of possibly having a conversation with the House Republicans, which is a great step in the right direction to getting this done, right? That's right.
But that's what Speaker McCarthy wants. I mean, he said that to me. He said it at the New York Stock Exchange. He just wants another conversation. He keeps saying, I met with Biden on February 1st. Why can I not have another conversation? So that's the White House now playing ball a bit with him.
It seems that way. And I mean, this is a good faith. I mean, really, the speaker is trying to put forth a bill that is something that they can talk about, something to discuss. The White House has been saying all along, we have to have something from you in order to be able to have a conversation. And it sounds like this might be the opening salvo.
So, Roger, we started the day with headlines. He caved. They went till 2 in the morning on the Rules Committee. Chaos. Caucus, the 5 families don't get along. I feel like I'm watching The Godfather.
This happens every 10 years or so.
Yeah, sure. We're going to the mattresses. But then we end the day with apparently the bill passing, Kevin McCarthy declaring victory. What's the strategy then for the White House?
First off, a quick poll. Would anyone here like to be Kevin McCarthy? I'm curious. Anyone?
You're asking for a show of hands.
I think we like our job.
Imagine going to bed at night knowing that your destiny is in the hands of Andy Biggs and Matt Gaetz. I mean, that can't be a comfortable place to be. And and tactically, I think what he really made a mistake doing was saying that coming into this, he would not make concessions to his own caucus, and then turned around and literally opened up the candy store. And so what I think you're seeing right here is kind of the embryonic version of how the next 18 months are going to play out. The Biden administration and the White House are going to just give the Republicans a lot of room to be who they are and say what they think and act how they're going to act, because they are arsonists rather than firefighters. And what you're seeing right now is the inability on their part to really coordinate votes and actually legislate, because that's really not the business they're in anymore.
At this moment, he is coordinating votes. He has only 4 no's at the moment. He brought this vote to a floor, and he likely thinks he has 218.
If this was happening in a vacuum, I could grant some of your point. But since the inception of the speakership, this particular speakership, you're seeing an inability to really corral his caucus. You never saw something like this play out with Speaker Pelosi.
You did, but it was just behind the scenes.
Well, but even.
But what's wrong with seeing it up in front for the world? This is people will push back and say, well, that's how democracy works, right? We're just seeing these hardball tactics that Speaker Pelosi would do behind doors.
Then I would still go to my original point, which is to set up the premise that he's not going to make concessions to his caucus and then do so very publicly around some of these Midwestern issues, around some of the work requirement issues, basically telegraphs that any time he says he's not going to make concessions, that's essentially saying he's very much willing to make concessions, which is an odd way to lead.
At the same time, Lisa, this was going to be the Transparency Caucus. It was going to be a return to regular order and no more backroom deals. This did not go through committee, and they're asking to cut a deal with Joe Biden. So which is it?
It seems to me like Kevin McCarthy has actually been very successful. This is, yes, it is not the way that typically this is done. He did come out last week and say, we're going to have a vote. This is what's going to be considered. I'm not going to negotiate. But yeah, he wants to get this to the floor, and he wanted to do it today because he knew that this was the conversation that had to get started. So to me, this actually looks quite a bit stronger. Behind the scenes, I am also hearing that some of this negotiation was even more than just the couple of factions and items that were in the bill. That in fact, some of the members that are not voting with him right now are asking for more than just what's in the bill. They are seeing this as an opportunity to get what they want from the speaker and not necessarily what they care about in the debt ceiling.
Right, because the debt ceiling, again, at this moment, for them is a leveraging tool. All right, our panel sticking with us. Coming up, Disney suing Florida Governor Ron DeSantis for allegedly jeopardizing their businesses as retaliation. Our panel stays with us to discuss. This is Balance of Power. All right, some breaking news right here. What's going on in Congress? House Republicans have passed this bill. This is the bill that Speaker McCarthy brought to the floor. He knew he was on the verge of getting 218. They passed this debt limit bill. But, Joe, as you and I have been saying, this is just a leverage point. This is obviously doomed in the Senate. It's never going to get to Biden's desk. But what it does do is it opens up potential conversations with the White House.
That's right. And it was a squeaker here. It turned out because of attendance, needed 217. He just got it across the finish line. There were several no's, as we described already. Yeah. Matt Gaetz among them, not a huge shock there. The last vote, by the way, just because we love trivia here in Washington, and you can't write this stuff. The last vote to help Speaker McCarthy, Mr. George Santos of New York.
Oh, wow. Okay, from very close to where I'm from.
This is why you need all the votes you can get.
And this is why, actually, leadership are struggling whether or not to look into the ethics committee, whether or not they should look into how this individual actually got to Congress, given his fabrications of his resume. All right, but that vote has passed, and we're going to move on to other issues of the day, especially Disney is suing Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. Earlier, they said this, alleging he's threatening billions of dollars in business as retaliation for the company speaking against his policies. Our panelists, Roger Fisk and Lisa Camusa-Miller, are still with us to discuss. Lisa, I have to start with you. This at one point was seen as good woke policy to play to your base. Has this gone too far now?
It really feels like it's gone too far, Anne-Marie. It feels to me
75,000 jobs.
Yeah, well, we've been saying that all along, that this was going to be interesting and of showing some backbone on DeSantis' part. But now it's really turned the corner. And to me, it really feels like this is working against him.
Okay, so overplayed your hand in this case, Roger? Is that the story? And is this advantage Donald Trump?
Yeah, I really think the Republican Party needs to figure out what their relationship is with the marketplace and with business. What used to be the split between the values voter and the fiscal conservative is really now the fiscal conservative and the MAGA vilification of corporate America kind of dynamic. And I completely agree with Lisa. He has dramatically overplayed his hand here. And he's, I think, operating in the vapor trails of the former president who used to vilify, CEOs and companies, very casually, almost on a daily or if not weekly basis. But as a pillar of the Republican Party, if they need to ask themselves if this is truly going to become ingrained in how they look at the marketplace, and if kind of vilification of woke ideology or whatever is more important than profitability and jobs, that's the clash that we're seeing coming into focus right now.
Well, let's take a listen to what the governor had to say about Disney. This was just from a few weeks ago. Take a listen.
We have a government of laws, it said, not a government of men. And that includes the law being superior to big corporations, even corporations as big and powerful as Walt Disney Company. They are not superior to the laws that are enacted by the people of the state of Florida.
And now we have Nikki Haley saying, Disney, come to South Carolina. I'm more than happy to have your jobs in my home state. This is really going to hurt him at this point as he looks to 2024. What does big businesses, what do donors think of this?
I think that they are concerned about the way that he's taken this stance. It looked as a sign. It was a sign of strength early on, as I said. But to me now, it really feels like a concern. It should be a concern for voters, for donors, for others, because what does that say about the way he would lead as a president? And that is really of great concern, I think, really for the entire marketplace. So this alone, this fight with Disney, to me, it feels like there have been a lot of strikes against the governor. This one feels like it could be the death blow.
Assuming that Disney wins this lawsuit, I would not bet against Bob Iger in this case, but this could cut both ways, right? If he loses the case, Ron DeSantis could see his campaign dreams go down in flames. But if Disney loses, Ron DeSantis could be a made man here, right?
Well, I guess it's hard to say. I think I might feel differently if he hadn't had a series of bad weeks all in a row, right? He's had a lot of really marked absences, marked missteps, and really he just feels to have a glass jaw. That's the one thing I keep hearing about him, that he's not battle tested. And that alone, Joe, is why I think regardless of how the lawsuit comes together, this is not helpful to the governor.
Of him on a debate stage with Donald Trump is quite.
Well, Donald Trump doesn't want to get on the stage with him.
Well, if he shows up, exactly. Roger Fisk, Lisa Camuso-Miller, great conversation, and thank you. Check out Bloomberg's new newsletter, Washington Edition. It's available on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. We'll see you right back here tomorrow.